Thank you. So we already know something about the audience. You're art people, and yet you get up early. So thank you for coming. The second instruction to you as an audience is you have to look at the panel, not at this gorgeous room, okay? You accept this condition. I will say just a few words, first of all, about the framing our discussion. It's not working? Okay, yes. What a difference. So I will say a few words about framing the discussion and very little, insufficient amount about each panelist, just so you have the flavor of their immense achievement in their own fields. What I'm going to say is, first I'm going to congratulate Linda on the theme of the coffee talks this year, challenging narratives. What is a more appropriate framing for discussions in the art world these days? Many narratives are being challenged, but I think it's quite significant that we begin with the narratives of ethnicities or regions or whatever, because we're so used to, and many of you are collectors almost by definition, you're here, or art people, so you have been taught a narrative, and you maybe have collected on that basis, which is the narrative of the progression of modernism in the West, mostly Europe, and then magically America starts showing up later in the 20th century. But our focus is the era where now there begins to be a full discussion among equals, among regions, about trends in modernity, in modernism. I think it's important to reference the fact, we all know it, that it's not that the early modernists were unaware of other parts of the world, but I think it's fair possibly to say, it's certainly a word of the moment, that they appropriated elements outside, but that was different from having a conversation in art with them. And so, yes, this is not the first time that the West looked at other regions, but I think we're all looking at each other in different ways these days. That's why this panel is so important. We are going to each, after I finally shut up, talk 10 minutes about the region. Everybody is entitled to take the question of what is modernism in the part of the world that they have spent a lot of time in, entirely on their own terms, so they can begin from any point, they can end from any point. The only thing that they must do is not spend more than 10 minutes. Okay, this is for their benefit, but I'm looking at you. And I will occasionally look at my iPhone. I'm not distracted then, it's my only phone, it's my only watch. So that will keep it. Then I will invite a conversation among the panelists if they heard something from the others, say, well, it's just like that with us or completely different in the world I specialized in. And then you will have an opportunity for questions. All of this magic will happen in 1 hour. So we'll see how we do. Let me now introduce very briefly, insufficiently, the panelists in the order that they are sitting. And by the way, they are sitting not alphabetically, but technologically. The first two will have some audio visuals, and the other two will not. That's the only reason for this order. So first, Layla Diba, who's now an independent scholar, art advisor, and curator. She has been director and chief curator of the, I got your name right, but not Negarestan Museum in Tehran, 1975 to 79. She doesn't know that I lived in Tehran a bit. Actually, it was in Shiraz at this time. So, so she's not kidding. She really did that. But she has done so many things in the context of the discussions about the Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi. She's a necessary person to talk about this region. That's what I will say. And not only the Iranian, but of course with a special interest and passion for Iranian culture. The second in the order, the technological order, is Kevin Dumouchelle, who joined the National Museum of African Art in October 2016. He was the lead curator for Visionary Viewpoints on Africa's Arts, which is the museum's recent permanent galleries. I was at the Smithsonian most of my career, and just watching African art as a museum develop its own sense of self has been very, very rewarding, and to have somebody of Kevin's caliber there is extremely important. I remember when the only African art you could see at the Smithsonian was in the Museum of Natural History. That says that's its own tale. Next, in order, again, remember how I seated them, so now I better, is BOON Tan. He's Vice President of Global Arts and Cultural Programs and Director of the Asia Society Museum. His predecessor, I believe, went on to the Hirshhorn. So there's this odd counter-tendency for people in New York to go to Washington, D.C., which I've always considered a mistake. But anyway, there's no place like New York. I've become a very chauvinistic New Yorker, even though I've only been here 4 years. Before that, he was a major figure in the Singapore art world. He was director of the Singapore Art Museum, had to do with cultural policy in Singapore in general, and is very aware of trends in Southeast Asia in contemporary art. So, of course, we welcome him. And then our variety, our variety is a necessary one because we have a gallerist here too. And to actually only have academics or even museum people proper in this discussion would be to miss the point of a lot of contemporary art today, particularly as it comes from regions of the world that are now so important to contemporary art. Leon Tovar began as a gallerist in Bogota, but now he is colonizing New York. I think that's a fair way to put it. It's a nice reversal. He has a gallery on the Upper East Side and now also in, yes. So he is a major spokesperson, both for what he says. By the way, his voice is a little hoarse today, so understand that maybe he won't talk as long as the others, but he will have much to say. But he is, by presenting this art, and of course museums have this role too, he brings Latin America into the conversation as an equal again. So with that, Layla, please.
Thank you very much, Mark. Can you hear me? Is the mic on? I have prepared to address the question of the presentation of modern Middle Eastern art in American museums, where we stand today. But Mark asked me to briefly begin with a sort of side topic, which is that I was asked a few years ago by the Guggenheim Museum to discuss the topic, is there a contemporary Islamic art? This is a very loaded question, very complex question. So my answer would be yes, there is an art of the modern Middle East, which is plentiful and can be seen in most cities in the world and collected, and it is a fascinating field. And yes, there is what one could call contemporary Islamic art, but with a very narrow definition, because it has to engage directly, not by appropriation or reference, with what Islamic religion and culture stands for. So that's all I'm going to say at this point, because I really want to move into the major focus of my remarks. So the question really is, how are American museums meeting the challenge of multiple modernities? Where do they stand today? Is it a time of resistance? Or are they meeting the challenge? Is it a time of transition? So this is the central question that concerned me. The interest in non-Western modernisms really began about 15 years ago in Europe and especially the United Kingdom, well ahead of America. And probably the seminal exhibition came from the British Museum, an exhibition called Word into Art, curated by Venetia Porter, which took as its premise that modern art of the Middle East could be defined by its engagement with calligraphy and text. So the process of the emergence of this exhibition was interesting because it came as a directive from the very top of the museum. The then director gave each department £10,000 and said to them, go out and buy whatever you want. So they had quite strong limitations, yet they also had a strong directive from the top. And this resulted in an extraordinary exhibition that really set the template, I think, for all the majority of approaches of museums to collecting and presentation for the next 15 years. At the same time that encyclopedic art museums were starting to pay attention, and of course galleries and Kunsthalles also, another interesting twist was that ethnographic museums began to play a major role. One of these was the museum in Rotterdam. And the rationale for this, why would an ethnographic museum present contemporary art, non-Western art of the Middle East, again, was that modern Middle Eastern art didn't fit into the traditional discourses and narratives of Western 20th century modernism. So it was easier to show it from an ethnographic viewpoint than from an art historical viewpoint. So after this brief discussion, just to generally, modern Middle Eastern art is presented from the point of view of how it engages with the past, rather than how it engages with world modernism, the history of world modernism, either through how it engages through text, as Venetia Porter did, or how it engages with current political issues. There was a show here in 2009 called Iran Inside Out, and the only raison d'etre for this major show was that there was unrest and revolutionary movements in Iran in 2009, and nowhere was the question of art addressed in terms of the reviews of the show, the critiques of the show, or even the curator's approach. So as you can see, I'm a curator, I'm an Islamicist, but a modernist, which is a strange bird indeed, a combination. So what I thought was, given that this is a complex field and a field that is in flux, with institutions looking at a variety of solutions, I thought I would present a series of case studies. So first, I'll look at examples of museums of modern art, then encyclopedic museums, and then temporary exhibitions. We're sort of moving backwards chronologically. In 2017, the Museum of Modern Art in New York mounted an extraordinary and unprecedented exhibition in response to the Trump's travel ban on 7 countries. And the stated purpose was to show that these artists were welcome on our shores. Stated purpose was not to talk about the history of modernism or to validate these artists in those terms. So it was a very important exhibition morally, and yet it was quite flawed. And so I will show you some examples. Here is a view of one of the galleries. The works were inserted into the permanent galleries of modern art, but of the earlier 20th century. And most of the works were from the 60s, 70s, and there was contemporary art as well. So the works from the 60s and 70s had been languishing in storage of MoMA since they were acquired in the early 1960s by Alfred Barr. So this was literally the first time since a recent acquisition show in 1966 that these works had been brought out. So the impact of the exhibition, I think, was very important because even by bringing these works out of storage, they were validating them. Now, but it was problematic. So in one case, the artist Marcos Grigorian, He was exhibited in the permanent installation devoted to post-World War II European art that dealt with unusual materials such as sand and sackcloth and non-traditional. And he was shown next to Antonio Tapias, which from every point of view worked very well. One of the problems that I perceived is that the label copy did not refer to the history of Iranian modern art and how it was engaging with European modernism at the time. So the label on Marcus Gregorian had a brief biography and then a political statement. And the wall text referred to modernism, post-World War II modernism, in every area of the world except the modern Middle East. So they really could have changed that a bit. Another work on view was Ibrahim al-Salahi, 1964, placed next to Pablo Picasso's guitar. What is the rationale for this? Well, certainly formal, but beyond that, according to reviews I've read, the rationale was that Picasso liked African art. Pardon?
That's the only place in the narrative?
That's the only place. One work that I think is really very difficult to understand, caused me some concern, why the work on the left, which is Iranian modernism, which is flat, decorative, and geometric, was placed next to an abstract expressionist such as Clifford Still. Here, in the room dedicated to Matisse, was placed a work by Hossein Zenderoudi, again, Iranian modernist who was one of the creators of the Sakakhaneh movement, which was a nationalist modern movement that was based on Persian popular culture and on abstraction. It was placed next to the Matisse, according to the articles I read, because it was nowhere apparent in the literature or formally, because Matisse liked Islamic art. So, as I said, a very important exhibition, but one that obviously it was put together literally in the period of a few weeks, and without a dedicated curator on staff who actually knew the regions. So we were beyond, many of us who work in this field were beyond excited that such a thing had happened. It's a wonderful first step. The Guggenheim, that I've had the honor to work with as a consultant since about 2006, had, from the time I was working there, an initiative called the UBS MAP initiative. And that was a very interesting innovation, I think, in terms of the way museums were handling this problem. Because the goal of the UBS MAP was to create 3 exhibitions. They engaged curators, young curators, in the fields of Latin American, Southeast Asian, and modern Middle East and North Africa. And each one was given the assignment to go to the region and source works for the collection locally, and then bring them back to New York, have an exhibition. There was no permanent record, okay? There's no catalog, and there was no permanent position. So again, here we have another, as I would say, influx ad hoc, but more thoughtfully thought through, because the acquisition of works in the Guggenheim does correspond to the vision and to the mission of the Guggenheim to collect abstract art. So even though they broadened this definition considerably, and with this project we're able to bring in a sizable range of artists in each of these areas. Here you see one installation shot, and the bottom section is an installation by a Kuwaiti artist, Ala Yunus. They acquired the works of 17 artists. Permanent collections. Encyclopedic museums have different problems because of issues of post-colonialism, territoriality, and essentialist views of non-Western art. Here is an example of work that was acquired. I want to thank the Brooklyn Museum for permission to discuss this. An Iranian artist called Sadegh Tirafkan, and he was acquired by the Department of the section of Islamic art, which is part of the Asian art department, by a then Iranian curator. And her rationale was, again, that this work was modern, yet it engaged specifically with the past. What past? In this case, Iran's local Iranian art history. The top section of this photograph it appropriates a scene, a battle scene from Persian popular culture, whether in print or in large scale, that the museum possessed. So there was a good rationale for buying this for the Asian art department. What is left out of the story is that Saadek Tirafkan himself in an interview had said that as a young art student in Tehran in the 1990s, he was studying photography, and all he could study was photojournalism. But through his own initiative, he discovered the work of Cindy Sherman. And Cindy Sherman was critical to his development as an artist, and he began doing staged photographs. So what do we have here? We only have half the story. Now, moving to temporary exhibitions. Temporary exhibitions can be more innovative and take more risks. And generally, they're also able to be more thematically focused than, obviously, installations. I just talked briefly before going to Shirin Nishat. I co-curated an exhibition at Asia Society in 2013 called Iran Modern. And with that exhibition, Asia Society and my colleagues and myself, we really were addressing the history of non-center modernism, modernism of the periphery, because the exhibition was devoted to the art of the 60s and 70s. After our exhibition, a number of other exhibitions happened, including the first solo Iranian women show, Monir Farman Farmayan, at the Guggenheim, and Shirin Nishat at the Smithsonian. This was an example, I think, of how artists can act as intermediaries in this process and influence the process. It was a very large retrospective of her work. But interesting, it included some objects of what we would call ethnographic or anthropological interest. And these were because the artist herself had very strong curatorial strategies and worked very closely with the museum director and curator. So here is a shot of part of the gallery. In the background, you see a pair of cut-off legs, and for those of you with very good eyesight, you'd recognize Shirin is using the same example of war imagery from print culture that Saadek did in the previous work. And on the right is the kind of work she's best known for, which is portraiture and text. And here is an example of the works that Shirin felt were important to include as part of the story of her narrative of an artist. And these are objects of popular culture, a talisman on the left and a printed book on the right, that they included in the exhibition. What happened is that when the Washington Post reviewer critiqued the show, he was extremely negative about the inclusion of this kind of material, ephemera or printed materials. And I got very upset and wrote a long review of the show for Brooklyn Rail, arguing that this was actually a very innovative and forward-looking presentation. So I'm almost finished. Just to brief conclusion, the field is in flux. And the question is, where do we go from here? I think that we need to search for commonalities. We need to search for interactions on a theoretical basis. And on a more practical basis, museums need to educate their curators through whatever means possible. And I think that we need to have more collection sharing. If you can't write the history of non-Western origins, you can let other museums do it and present it and share collections. So this is where I think we are. We're in a transitional moment that I hope can become an integrative moment in the future. So,
I don't know how you said so much in so little time. Thank you. Okay. Kevin, please.
Hello, it's a pleasure to speak with you here today. I am going to try to give you just a very brief sort of snapshot into my curatorial practice over the last 10 years in hopefully slightly under 10 minutes, so bear with me. I am now the curator at the National Museum of African Art. It is the only fine art museum in the world dedicated to telling the full story of Africa's arts from antiquity to today. And it is an incredible honor and privilege and responsibility, I think, to be a custodian of that narrative. And I'm really quite pleased to see the way in which this panel was framed. It was around the question of narrative, because as a historian who came to art history first actually through African history, this question of the framing of Africa's history, Africa's narrative, is one that's really central to my career. And I think particularly around the issue of modernity. The idea of modernity, the idea of modernism, is always been used as a sort of cudgel, as a form of inclusion and exclusion, particularly in the colonial era, as a way of sort of keeping Africa and other places outside of the Euro-American sort of core or center out of the sort of larger narrative of historical progression and modernity. And my scholarly projects have always been focused around an attempt to re-center our understanding of narrative, to decenter it away from Europe and the West, and to understand the sort of coeval experience of modernity in a place like Africa. So I'll give you just two examples, two sort of broad sort of trajectories that I've been facing in the last 10 years. First, actually, also at the Brooklyn Museum, where I was a curator in charge of the arts of Africa and the Pacific Islands for just under 10 years. And you can sort of sense already some of the tensions therein if you just look at that title alone. There's Africa and the Pacific Islands really have nothing to do with each other other than their relationship to the Western history. And then I'll conclude by speaking just for a moment or two of recent work at the Smithsonian. When I inherited the collection in 2007 at Brooklyn, it was a collection that is one of the finest and most important in the country, but one that was very rooted in a particular sort of time and a particular way of thinking about Africa. There was actually only one work of art in that collection that was created in the last 50 years. So one of my first sort of efforts was really to try to just broaden the scope of our collecting practices as best we could with very limited resources and limited support at that time. But I was able to acquire in the first few years a handful of important modern and contemporary works. And I had enough at that point, I thought, when we were faced with the need to reinstall the collection in 2011, to attempt to try to present for the first time the African collection in a broad historical narrative. And so African Innovations, which opened in 2011, was really our first attempt to tell a broadly sort of historical trajectory of Africa's arts, beginning with a section focused on antiquity writ large, basically up until 1800, and then framing the heart of that collection as being rooted in a very specific moment in time, which is really the colonial era. It's the 19th and early 20th century. And so the heart of African Innovations included 5 different galleries that looked at sort of thematic cross-cutting sections within the collection, but framed in that very specific moment of history. And then in the next slide, we had our first sort of dedicated space for showing the arts of Africa in the last 50 years. And it was really quite important to me at that point to just be able to establish first for our audiences that Africa has this history of modern and contemporary art, and to give works that were sort of samples of that sort of larger narrative. And so this included works like a piece by Yinka Shonibari, a British artist of Nigerian descent, as well as a work of so-called traditional art from Malawi that was very much engaged with global pop culture as well. And it's also to establish that genres that we think of as being sort of outside of sort of modern time are in fact actually coeval and participant in this larger conversation as well. I also, during that period, had a chance to present a number of traveling exhibitions that came to us, including the wonderful monographic exhibition of Layla in 2013, and here, again, I had a chance to rewrite the show and really focus it a little bit more on trying to situate the practice of someone like Layla Natsui in African history more globally, or more specifically. That he is not just this amazing sort of African wunderkind who's sort of appeared out of nowhere, as it might seem if we're looking at his work purely from a Western perspective, but instead I tried to also remind our visitors that he comes out of a long university art tradition in Nigeria itself. The permanent collections at Brooklyn in 2013 were rehung again, and this gave me a chance to experiment a little bit further. So we continued the idea of African Innovations, but turned it on its head, called it Double Take African Innovations. And here I attempted to sort of subvert the narrative a little bit, but after having sort of established for our visitors a chronological story, I tried to tell a story that cut across time, so that looked at thematic sort of connections between works that seem on one level quite disparate. A contemporary work by Congolese artist Aimé Ampane on the left, and a 19th century Cuba masque, but that are both works that address power in their specific localities. A work that represents the dispossessed of 21st century Kinshasa on the left, and the royal power in central Congo on the right. Or looked at a conversation like design in African art as being rooted primarily in African precedents rather than being rooted in a Western narrative. And then the final project that I had the chance to work on at Brooklyn was an exhibition entitled Disguise, Masks in African Art, which was an attempt to try to, which was primarily a sort of survey of a living artists working around issues of masquerade in performance art. But again, we tried to really sort of root even those practices in framing an understanding of African masquerade as a form of performance art in its own right as well. As Mark mentioned, I had the chance to join the Smithsonian in October 2016, and here I'm faced with an entirely different set of questions. Here, this is a collection that is really deeply specific, one where we are able to tell Africa's history in a much more sort of complex way, where we have multiple works by a major Nigerian modernist like Ben Nwonwu, in which we are able to see works from early in his career in the 40s and in the 70s. We're able to tell a richer story. So this is the project that I've most recently worked on, Visionary Viewpoints in Africa's Arts, designed as a permanent collection gallery and as a sort of introduction to how to look at African art for a Smithsonian visitor, which we have to sort of presume has little to no background in Africa or Africa's history. So this is a very broad introduction to different ways of looking at Africa's arts. But one of the central galleries that we see depicted here was focused specifically on artists and the identity of artists and the history and the training and development of artists. And we were able to tell a story that moves in multiple directions at the same time. On the right side of this gallery, we have a number of works from the Yoruba world, where we talk about the training and apprenticeship of Yoruba arts in the 20th century, and that an artist like Oluwayevise, who made that incredible bowl in the back and that door, is working in the 1940s, and we can frame him as being coeval in time with artists on the left who are working in art traditions coming out of universities in places like Nsukka, Nigeria, or Khartoum in Sudan. And so we were able to tell that sort of much more specific story as part of this sort of larger framework and introduction to Africa's arts, to really begin to give our visitors a sense of the depth and complexity of Africa's history and the long ways in which African artists have been engaging with this question of modernism and modernity. So we'll leave it there, and we'll pick up in questions.
Hi, I'm Boon Hui. I'm from the Asia Society. I was asked to make some sort of a few statements about how to look at basically modernism in Asia, and that sort of balked me a bit because we are talking about almost 2/3 of humanity. But I will try and make I think 3 broad points that are not, in a sense, summarizing it, but I believe they are, through the 2-3 decades of my work, there are ways in which, someone who is coming into this field is able to begin to approach the subject matter. One is that, and I will try and give some examples, and the reason why, later at the end I'll say the reason why I'm not showing pictures is very specific. One is that I think one has to realize that across the many regions of Asia, modernism, or modern art as we know it when it appeared, you need to interpret it in the context of decolonization and the struggle over the nation state. That is very, very sort of important for one reason, that after national independence happens in many art scenes across Asia, the struggles that you see, the battles that artists fought, or people who are involved in the art fought over what should be the art that we should have at this time are actually not battles of art. They are battles over national ideology. So in the fall, we're doing the first exhibition on the Bombay progressives, that first generation of painters and sculptors that emerged after the independence of India in 47 and the partition. And what is interesting was that, of course, people like M.F. Hussain, like Souza, they actually hated the Bengal school. They hated the Tagores, the ones that in a sense, were very Asian, because they were using these ink washers and they venerated, the East Asian sort of traditions, which is, keep that in mind because it's going to be very ironic later. And they hated the Tagores and the Bengal school, or they were very adverse because they felt that it was feudal. They felt. So one of the ways to look at modern art, really, and how it manifests in the struggles of the nation is, in a sense, this insistence by many scenes and artists in many scenes that there was some sort of break, even while there was a kind of continuity. I think Layla said this thing about a kind of particular kind of critique or a dialogue with its own history rather than in a sense, Western or Euro-American, let me be very specific, Euro-American modernism. And the other example where I work in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, if you look at Indonesian art, you realize that after independence, the major battle crystallized this exact kind of thing. Is your art Western? Should our art be Western, whatever they deem to be? And usually when by Western art, many of the debates are looking at Western abstraction. And of course, the form that is most important usually is Cubism. Various forms of Cubism was taken to be, in a sense, the Western sort of style. So many, whether it's in China, in India, in Southeast Asia, you see the sudden kind of interaction with Cubist ideas. And it's interesting in that sense. In Indonesia, the battle in the 50s onwards to the 60s, all the way between the art schools of Yogyakarta and the art school of Bandung is, in a sense, a kind of battle over art, but also the nation. The Bandung school, with its, in a sense, Dutch teachers, was attacked. The very first exhibition by artists coming out of the Bandung school was intensely attacked by the proponents of the Yogyakarta school, who were very social realists, whose idea was that modern art should look at the little people. They call the rakyat kecil, the little people, the people of the street, life as it is lived now, not a kind of, and the term that was used to describe the Bandung school and their sort of Western abstraction influence was, why should our art be a laboratory for the West? Terms like that appeared. So, when you're looking at these modernist things, I think you need to also look at the internal kind of battles, and this battle is not just about art, it's about national ideology. Similarly, with the Indian progressives, the exact kind of same thing happened. Why, in a sense, Hussain, somebody like M.F. Hussain, who ironically was rejected by his own nation later in life, would say, as a citizen of the new nation, we weren't looking at these things. We were looking at Chola bronzes. We were looking at Tang pottery. We were looking at the Mithura sculpture. We were looking at our Indian miniatures. That is where, in a sense, our sort of modern painting came from. Even though we were using oil on easel, we were painting with the easel, we were using oil. The insistence is that, no, that's not how you look at it. Now, the other thing is, of course, what seems very obvious is that that kind of progression of isms is completely useless when you're looking at modern art in Asia, because it always, from its beginning, it was already global. And one of the reasons is one has to note that many of the art schools in which oil painting first was introduced in the curriculum was actually started by the Europeans. Whether it's in Vietnam, in Indonesia, was started by the Europeans. So immediately from right before independence, once these schools started, they knew what was going on everywhere else, And I'm sure the story of Chinese art and even the Chinese contemporary art, before Tiananmen, is very obvious. It's not that they were reading about Western art. Things were smuggled in, images of the Western modernists were smuggled in on photocopied. They were looking at things in photocopy. They had no idea what it was. We showed an artist from Indonesia called FX Sasono, the leader of, in a sense, that kind of social activist art and installation artist. And his first works, he was asked, does it look like Duchamp? He said, I've seen, but I have no idea what it means. It just looked very interesting that you could do art using things that you found. Everywhere in society or in the house. So I think that kind of mixing, that kind of, in a sense, that I don't really care whether it's a Western, it's an Asian, it's my own history, is very important when you look at modern Asian art, because it's not a reductive, it's almost a kind of cauldron, a kind of crucible where many things are thrown in. And then sort of all these very strange things come out. And the last point I'm going to make is that the other thing that makes it very difficult for those of us who are trained in a kind of Euro-American tradition, I think it shares some things also with the African kind of scene, is that the distinction between craft and fine art frequently is not there, simply because the artists, especially at the modern period, was trying to find an authentic voice that was separate from the colonial metropole, from the style. So even if they were using cubist things, they were looking at their own sort of indigenous craft tradition. So when you come to the Indian show at the Asia Society in September, you will see there will be that many of the sort of images, they are mining their own indigenous iconography, and very specifically, these painters are all people living basically in the cities. But what they were mining was very specific local cultures, and a lot of times the artists loved the people of the land, so to speak, to use a very kind of romantic generalization, because they were seen as the actual real, it's not a conceptual, it's real living connection to something that is authentic. So the art that, in a sense, is an interaction, a dialogue with that, has to be authentic. It is not an abstract kind of concept. So I just want to leave it at that, and then I think we can
I won't let you leave until you tell us why you didn't do any audiovisual presentation.
Well, because I didn't want to get into the discussion of, I think it became clear particularly from Layla's discussion of, when you look at the image, what is the lens through which you are looking at it? Are we looking at it through a kind of Western museological lens? And the other main reason, which makes it very difficult, particularly for us sitting in New York, is that in Asia, the scene is moving so fast. Everything I'm saying is changing right at this moment. And our 12-hour difference is actually more than that, because you are in a kind of scene that is literally making and remaking itself even as we speak. I will just give one final example as a very technical kind of point. Like, if those of you who are familiar with photography, you will see that it is at a certain point in time, 10 years ago, something like that, it was the Chinese, the contemporary artists, who started using these monumental 20-meter photographs. Right, you imagine the Miao Xiaochun, because I bought this ridiculously sized thing in Singapore, which everybody is cursing me for now. But, they were the ones who said, hey, it's possible. Technically, we could do a photograph that is as big as we can get it. And why? Because it was not photography, it was a monumental landscape painting, except using this medium. They didn't really care what it was. So the lens through which we see these things tend to be very, very problematic with Asian art.
Thanks so much. I'm sorry for my voice. I lost it yesterday. But our approach and our challenges from the commercial part which is our segment. They start long time ago in 1991 when I opened the gallery in Bogota. In the beginning, obviously, we was surrounded of Latin American art, and I get the idea to bring conceptual and minimal art to Latin America. And our first exhibition was Sol Louis. And I traveled to New York, and I talked with Sol. I told him, Sol, I want to make an exhibition in Colombia. And they told me, well, that's pretty challenging. And then, well, let's try. And we start to make the wall drawings in Colombia. When the people and the collectors from Latin America, they start to approach us, they don't understand at all what we're doing. And then they asked me, Leon, this is very different show like the Latin American things. I said, yes, but let me explain to you how this is working. Then in pretty short time, we get very famous because we are not selling anything, just a certificate from Sol Louis, and they make an article in the news that we are probably robbed the clients, that we are like a thief, that we are doing everything wrong and everything was fake. And then I start to understand the challenge of having a gallery and the legitimate to be, let's put it like that, legally correct in the field. After Sol Louis, we make a Joseph Albers exhibition that Denise Rene and Sidney Janis help us to make it in Colombia. Again, the people was like, well, who is the artist? The artist is alive. You know, it was a full process of education. And then I start to understand our position of an art dealer and also galleries. We don't want to pretend to be a musician, but we start to do our home research and our own investigations. After these important exhibitions, we start to get clients internationally from the region, like from Venezuela. That was probably one of the first approach with the Cisneros collection, because they sent people to ask, Leon, why you do these exhibitions in Latin America? This is quite even advanced for the States, because it was in the late 80s, early 90s, which is already 20 years ago. And then we start to make an interaction with the collectors from very advanced collectors from Latin America. After this process, in Colombia, we have a very difficult security problems in the 80s and the 90s. Obviously, we was a very well-known gallery, and we start to have our own political problems. And in that time, I used to work with dealers here in New York, like Sidney Janis or Andrew Emmerich, and Marisa Del Rey, and in some point we have a serious security problems, and we decide to move the gallery from Latin America to New York. That was the most dramatic part of that segment of the story. And then when I arrived to New York, I start to talk obviously with Sol Louis, with Calandre, with the artists that we promote in Latin America. And everybody started to tell me, Leon, you know, we love you, but I work with Paula Cooper, I work with Pace, with a very important galleries here, and then we start to face another challenge. Pretty soon I understand was something that I need to read more about it. And then we start to discover no conversations, but the real connections with Latin America. And then we start to develop a project and a program based in the Latin American Modernism. Pretty soon we discovered that some of the American artists, even European artists, they have tremendous similarities with the Latin Americans, modernists, neo-concrete, conceptual artists, geometric abstraction from Latin America. And then we get back to Torres Garcia, and then we start to discover, first, obviously, that Fontana was not Italian, was from Santa Fe, Argentina. We start to discover many things. And then we create a group of young people, they work for the gallery, and we start to make an investigations. And then we start to present exhibitions like Edgar Negret. You know, there has been a piece in the MoMA for 65 years that there has been never shown. We discovered that the MoMA have a collection of Latin American art in their storage for 35 years and never has been shown. After that was a small art fair here called Pinta, which was dedicated to Latin America. Simultaneously, the auction houses, they start to make the Latin American auctions, which help us a lot to put us a little bit in the map. But at the end, even the auction houses was a little lost. They don't recognize what's contemporary and modern, and then the first was an auction of contemporary art, and then no modern and contemporary. And then I was confused too, and then we decide we will not believe in anyone. We will do our own homework. Then we make an investigation from a specific sculpture, which was the bridge, and was homage to Paul Foster. That was the title of the sculpture from Edgar Negret, in which he was born in Colombia. And we start to investigate. And then we find Mr. Paul Foster, which was an old gentleman from probably 90 years old. We call him, listen, Mr. Foster, we find a sculpture from a Colombian artist that is in your honor. You know, it's a bridge from Edgar Negret. And they told me, no, Leon, you are completely wrong. I write a play for Broadway called The Bridge, but the bridge is making in honor of Edgar Negret, the sculpture. Then we learned that our position was we have a lack of information in real time, and then we start to see the connections between Fontana and Soto, and then we find documents when Yves Klein was probably his favorite artist was Jesus Rafael Soto, which probably everybody knows. He's probably one of the most important kinetic artists in the world, born in Venezuela. And then we just find a connection, a real connection, how Pomodoro developed his sculptures in Mexico, and exactly the same foundry with Edgar Negret, or even Sergio Tosi, which developed the sculptures of Fontana. Also, they did the sculptures of Jesus Rafael Soto. They share colors, they use the same colors sometimes. Some of the pieces that Soto has, they have the international Klein blue made by Yves Klein. But it was, then we understand that after this modernity of communications, they separate Latin America from everywhere. But in the 50s and the 40s, the artists, they were together. We discovered that Edgar Negret was part of the group of Louis Nevelson, John German, Kelly, and Agnes Martin. And when they present the whole group, there were 5 artists to the Whitney Biennale. They accept the whole projects, but as soon they discovered that Negret was from Popayán, Colombia, they put him out of the Whitney Biennale, and he returned to Colombia very depressed. And that's the type of investigations that we did just to get support in the commercial part. To make everything short, was a beautiful article in Forbes talking about our gallery and how serious are because not only we do the commercial part, we support very strong our artists. And today you need to read the article in the New York Times talking about TEFAF and the important galleries there, but also they are talking about the importance of the geometric abstraction from Latin America. That's what we do.
Thank you. Our panelists have filled the time with their intelligence and expertise. I'm going to ask just one question that may be a unifying one in terms of concern. And then if Linda will allow just a few minutes, not so many. After that, we'll get a few questions from the audience, but we must all be brief. The one question I want to ask you, although I have so many as a result of your presentations, is what is the idea of a cultural capital now? Is this useful for a truly global conversation of modernism? Is this just the current manifestation of the control of the narrative by certain regions, cities, and so forth? What do you think about a cultural capital, or maybe in the regions that interest you? There may be emerging cultural capital. How do you deal with this question? Layla, do you?
Well, certainly in the Middle East, there are great aspirations to be the new New York or the new Paris. But also artists and many intellectuals feel that museums are outmoded and outdated. And do cultural capitals really exist in the era of the internet?
Yeah.
Yes, no, certainly. Well, and I think, the idea of a cultural capital, I think from a Western perspective, if I can try to empathize what that must look like, still looks as if it is very much part of a sort of neo-colonial, post-colonial model. And what's really exciting that's happening now, again, in Africa as well, is we have this vast sort of flourishing of art centers, museums, private galleries that are happening in major cities across the continent. And we really feel it's our responsibility as the National Museum of African Art in Washington is to develop and nurture very close relationships with those spaces, and in a way maybe even try to develop partnerships wherein we're allowing those spaces to drive the conversation that we have here in the West.
I think we are living in a kind of world of the region. So when we say cultural capital, I think we are increasingly, and it's very obvious in Asia, you're looking at a kind of network of certain nodes which are cities, but they are very tied to specific regions around them. You see obviously in the Middle East, in China, places in Shanghai, for instance, is very, very strong. Southeast Asia is very strong. India, what's going on in Lahore. So I think these are it's these kinds of nodes, but also the way they connect each other. I think that's very important. Like where I come from, Singapore obviously is trying, because it has capital, it's trying to pull all these things in the region together.
But in the case of modernism of Latin America, I think if you see the title of the exhibitions, for example, the UBS exhibition, the title of Pablo León de la Barra was Under the Same Sun, means that Getty Museum, MoMA, Guggenheim, they are put the Latin American modernists in the map as the same level, because at the end, modernist, it doesn't have any type of region, because it's not talking about world, it's talking about a planet, because if we don't get to the beginning and learn from the artists themselves, we cannot impose as curators, as dealers, as auction houses. This is the Latin American auction, this is the contemporary, whatever, which is a lie. Now we are working very hard to close something that helped us in the beginning, which was the Latin American auctions. It doesn't make sense anymore. Mata, Gorky, Frida Kahlo, Matt with the surrealist, minimal art. We have our own segment, which is exactly the same as every part in the world.
I know there are questions for the audience. We're really out of time. That is so wonderful a last word. That is the last word, and now you may applaud the panel.